43 years ago, on November 18, 1982, Alice Harris disappeared after leaving her modest apartment on Chicago's South Side for an evening walk with Buddy, her German Shepherd guide dog. The 41-year-old music teacher, who had been blind since birth, vanished without a trace, plunging her family into tragedy and depression while leaving the community in complete confusion. Alice had been a pillar of strength in the Bronzeville neighborhood. Despite her visual impairment, she had earned a master's degree in music education and taught piano lessons to children from her home studio. Her students adored her gentle patience and remarkable ability to identify their emotions through the subtle changes in their playing. Buddy, her 4-year-old guide dog, had been her constant companion since 2019, trained at the prestigious Seeing Eye School in New Jersey. On that cold November evening, Alice's routine was as predictable as clockwork. Every day at 6:30 p.m., she would harness Buddy and take their familiar route around the neighborhood, 3 blocks north to the small park, a loop around the perimeter, then straight home. The walk never took more than 30 minutes. Neighbors had grown accustomed to seeing the pair, often waving or calling out greetings that Alice would return with her warm, distinctive laugh. Margaret Chen, Alice's upstairs neighbor, was the last person to see her alive. "I was coming home from grocery shopping when I passed Alice in the hallway," Margaret would later tell investigators. "She seemed perfectly normal, maybe even happier than usual. She mentioned something about Buddy needing extra exercise because he'd been restless all day. I watched from my window as they walked down the street together. Buddy was pulling slightly ahead, which was unusual for such a well-trained dog." When Alice failed to return by 8 p.m., Margaret grew concerned. Alice was obsessively punctual, a necessity for someone navigating the world without sight. By 8:30, Margaret had called Alice's sister Patricia, who lived 20 minutes away on the north side. Patricia immediately drove over, and together they searched the usual walking route, calling Alice's name and whistling for Buddy. The Chicago Police Department initially treated the case as a routine missing person report. Detective Robert Martinez, who caught the case, would later admit that the department's response was inadequate. "In 1982, we didn't have the protocols we have today for vulnerable adults," Martinez recalled years later. "Alice was an independent woman who lived alone. The initial assumption was that maybe she'd gotten disoriented and would find her way home. The first 48 hours revealed disturbing inconsistencies. Alice's apartment showed no signs of struggle, but her evening medication, crucial insulin injections for her diabetes, remained untouched on the kitchen counter. This was the detail that transformed the case from a possible wandering incident to something far more sinister. Alice would never have left home without her insulin kit, especially for what should have been a brief walk. Search teams combed the neighborhood and surrounding areas. Volunteers from Alice's church, students and parents from her music program, and concerned neighbors formed search parties that scoured alleys, abandoned buildings, and the nearby Lake Michigan shoreline. The search expanded to include forest preserves and suburban areas, based on the theory that Alice and Buddy might have been picked up by someone and taken outside the city. Detective Martinez interviewed Alice's family, friends, and students, searching for any indication of trouble in her life. What emerged was the portrait of a woman who, despite facing significant challenges, had built a fulfilling and stable existence. Alice had never married, but maintained close relationships with her 2 sisters, Patricia and Linda. She had no known enemies, no financial troubles, and no romantic entanglements that might have led to complications. The investigation revealed one puzzling detail. Several neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar dark sedan parked on Alice's street during the days leading up to her disappearance. The car had been noticed because it seemed out of place in a neighborhood where most residents knew each other's vehicles. However, no one had thought to write down the license plate number, and descriptions of the vehicle were frustratingly vague. As days turned into weeks, the police investigation began to lose momentum. Without physical evidence or credible leads, the case was gradually deprioritized. The Harris family, however, refused to accept that Alice had simply vanished into thin air. Patricia quit her job as a bank teller to dedicate herself full-time to searching for her sister, printing flyers, organizing search parties, and pressuring police to continue investigating. The family's anguish deepened as winter settled over Chicago. Alice's absence left a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. Her piano students, many of whom had been with her for years, struggled to understand where their beloved teacher had gone. Parents found themselves explaining the inexplicable to children who kept asking when Miss Alice would be back to help them prepare for their spring recital. Christmas 1982 was a hollow affair for the Harris family. Patricia and Linda maintained Alice's apartment exactly as she had left it, paying rent and utilities in the hope that their sister would somehow return. Alice's Christmas presents, carefully wrapped and labeled in Braille, remained under Patricia's tree until the following summer, when the crushing reality of permanent loss finally began to set in. The Chicago Police Department considered various possibilities, but could not resolve the crime, causing outrage in the Harris family, who never lost hope. Patricia Harris Williams would later establish a missing persons advocacy group, fighting so that the truth would come to light, and other families wouldn't endure the same bureaucratic indifference that had characterized the early days of Alice's case. As 1983 dawned, the Alice Harris case had settled into the frustrating routine of a cold investigation. Detective Martinez continued to follow up on sporadic tips and reported sightings, but each lead dissolved under scrutiny. The official case file grew thicker with false starts and dead ends, while the Harris family's private investigation took on a desperate intensity that would define their lives for the next 2 years. Patricia Harris Williams had transformed her dining room into a makeshift command center. Maps of Chicago and surrounding counties covered the walls, marked with colored pins indicating search areas, reported sightings, and locations where similar disappearances had occurred. She had learned to navigate the complex bureaucracy of missing persons cases, building relationships with sympathetic officers, social workers, and volunteers who understood that Alice's disappearance was not just another statistic. The family hired private investigator Frank Kowalski, a former Chicago police detective who specialized in cold cases. Kowalski brought a methodical approach that differed markedly from the official investigation. While police focused on active leads and current tips, Kowalski began reconstructing Alice's life in minute detail, believing that the key to her disappearance lay in understanding patterns and relationships that might not have seemed significant at the time. Kowalski's investigation revealed aspects of Alice's routine that had been overlooked. Alice received weekly deliveries from a local grocery store, arranged through a service designed to help visually impaired residents maintain independence. The delivery driver, Thomas Brennan, had been making these deliveries for 6 months before Alice's disappearance. Brennan, 34, had keys to Alice's apartment and detailed knowledge of her schedule and habits. When Kowalski interviewed Brennan, inconsistencies emerged. Brennan claimed he had made his usual Thursday delivery on November 17th, the day before Alice disappeared, but grocery store records showed the delivery had been cancelled. When pressed, Brennan became defensive and suggested that Alice had been acting strange in the weeks before her disappearance, making comments about feeling watched and being concerned about someone following her. This revelation was devastating to Patricia. Alice had never mentioned feeling unsafe to her family, but Kowalski's investigation suggested that Alice might have been protecting her sisters from her own growing fears. Several of Alice's piano students, when interviewed more thoroughly, recalled that Alice had seemed distracted during their final lessons. 8-year-old Timothy Morrison told his mother that Miss Alice had asked him unusual questions about whether he had seen any strangers in the neighborhood. The investigation took a darker turn when Kowalski discovered that Thomas Brennan had a criminal record that hadn't been disclosed during his employment screening. In 1978, he had been arrested for breaking and entering, though charges were later dropped due to lack of evidence. More troubling, Brennan had been fired from a previous job after complaints from elderly female clients about inappropriate behavior and violations of privacy. Detective Martinez, initially skeptical of the private investigation, began to take Kowalski's findings seriously. A joint effort was mounted to locate and question Brennan more thoroughly, but by March 1983, Thomas Brennan had disappeared. His apartment had been vacated, his employment terminated, and his forwarding address led to a non-existent location in Milwaukee. The search for Brennan became a priority, but proved frustratingly elusive. He seemed to have vanished as completely as Alice herself, leading investigators to wonder whether he had fled due to guilt or had met with foul play from someone else connected to Alice's disappearance. Bank records showed that Brennan had withdrawn his savings in cash during the first week of March, suggesting a planned departure rather than sudden flight. Meanwhile, the community's response to Alice's disappearance had evolved from immediate concern to a more complex mixture of sympathy, frustration, and gradual acceptance. The initial wave of volunteers had dwindled as months passed without progress. Some neighbors began to whisper theories about Alice having chosen to disappear, despite the obvious impossibility of a blind woman successfully vanishing without assistance. These whispers caused additional pain for the Harris family, who found themselves defending Alice's character and mental state to people who should have been offering support. Linda Harris Coleman, Alice's younger sister, struggled with depression and guilt, convinced that she should have been more attentive to signs that Alice might have been in danger. The family dynamics, once characterized by playful teasing and shared responsibilities, became strained under the weight of uncertainty and conflicting theories about what had happened. The seasonal cycle of hope and despair became a defining feature of the family's experience. Each spring brought renewed energy for searches and investigation, while winter's arrival marked another year of Alice's absence. Patricia developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to potential clues, following up on every reported sighting, every anonymous tip, and every piece of correspondence that might relate to Alice's fate. Church services became both a source of comfort and painful reminder of loss. Alice had been the pianist for St. Mark's Baptist Church, and her absence left a silence that no replacement could fill adequately. Reverend James Washington tried to maintain hope in his sermons, but the congregation's prayers for Alice's safe return began to shift gradually toward prayers for peace and acceptance for her family. The police investigation had settled into a routine of periodic file reviews and responses to tips, but no new leads emerged. Detective Martinez, nearing retirement, began to express private doubts about whether the case would ever be solved. The absence of physical evidence, credible witnesses, or clear motives had created an investigative vacuum that seemed unlikely to be filled without dramatic new information. As 1983 progressed, the Harris family faced a terrible choice: continue the intensive search efforts that were consuming their emotional and financial resources, or begin the process of grieving and moving forward without answers. Patricia remained adamantly opposed to any suggestion of giving up, but Linda and other family members began to question whether their efforts were healthy or sustainable. The one-year anniversary of Alice's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a temporary surge in tips and reported sightings, but none proved credible. November 18, 1983, became a day of vigil and remembrance rather than celebration or closure. The family gathered at Alice's favorite park, the same location where she and Buddy had walked countless times, to hold a memorial service and renew their commitment to finding the truth. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The second year of Alice Harris's disappearance brought a crushing sense of routine to what should have been an extraordinary situation. By early 1984, the case had settled into the bureaucratic rhythm of periodic reviews, filed reports, and diminishing returns on investigative effort. Yet beneath this official quietude, several parallel investigations continued with the desperate intensity that only comes from refusing to accept the unacceptable. Patricia Harris Williams had evolved from grieving sister to amateur detective, developing skills and instincts that impressed even seasoned law enforcement professionals. Her dining room command center had expanded into a sophisticated information network that connected missing persons cases across the Midwest. She had learned to read police reports, interpret investigative protocols, and identify patterns that might escape overworked detectives handling dozens of cases simultaneously. The search for Thomas Brennan had yielded frustrating near misses and false leads. Thomas Brennan had been arrested for vagrancy in Detroit, but proved to be a different person entirely. Another sighting in Minneapolis led to a week-long investigation that ended when the subject was confirmed to be alive and employed under his real name. Private investigator Frank Kowalski had developed a theory that Brennan was using false identification, possibly with assistance from criminal associates connected to his previous arrests. More disturbing was the discovery that Alice's case was not unique. Kowalski's research had identified 4 other disappearances of visually impaired or elderly women in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana over the previous 5 years. While the circumstances varied, each case involved women who lived alone, maintained predictable routines, and had some form of regular service contact with delivery personnel, maintenance workers, or home health aides. Detective Martinez, initially skeptical of this pattern analysis, began to take the connections seriously after consulting with colleagues in other jurisdictions. The Milwaukee Police Department confirmed that 67-year-old Helen Kowalski, no relation to the private investigator, had disappeared in 1979 under similar circumstances, including a missing service worker who had vanished shortly after her disappearance. The Indianapolis Metro Police had a comparable case involving 52-year-old Margaret Torres, who had disappeared with her guide dog in 1981. The possibility of a serial predator targeting vulnerable women created a new urgency in the investigation, but also revealed the limitations of interjurisdictional cooperation in the early 1980s. Communication between police departments relied on telephone calls, mailed reports, and personal relationships between detectives. The kind of database analysis that would later become routine was impossible with the technology available, meaning that pattern recognition depended on human memory and manual record comparison. Alice's family found themselves caught between hope and horror at these developments. The possibility that Alice had been victimized by a serial offender offered a potential explanation for her disappearance, but also suggested that her fate might be far worse than they had dared to imagine. Patricia struggled with the ethical implications of hoping that other families had suffered similar losses, while simultaneously recognizing that multiple cases offered the best chance of eventual resolution. The financial strain of maintaining a private investigation had begun to affect the entire extended family. Patricia had depleted her savings, borrowed against her home, and accepted donations from church members and community supporters. Linda and other relatives contributed what they could, but the costs of private investigators, travel for interviews, and maintaining Alice's apartment had created debt that would take years to resolve. Community support had evolved in complex ways as the second year progressed. The initial wave of volunteers and donors had been replaced by a smaller but more committed group of advocates who understood that finding Alice would require sustained effort over potentially many years. Mrs. Eleanor Washington, an elderly church member who had lost her own daughter to an unsolved murder in 1976, became Patricia's closest ally and emotional support system. The neighborhood itself had changed subtly in response to Alice's disappearance. Women who had previously felt safe walking alone began traveling in pairs or avoiding evening outings entirely. Parents developed more restrictive rules for their children, and several residents installed additional locks and security measures. The sense of violated safety extended beyond Alice's immediate area, affecting the broader South Side community's collective sense of security. Alice's piano students, now almost 2 years removed from their last lessons, had processed her absence in different ways. Some had continued with new teachers, while others had abandoned music entirely, associating piano playing with the trauma of their teacher's unexplained disappearance. Timothy Morrison, who had been Alice's youngest student, developed anxiety around strangers and refused to answer the door when his parents weren't home. The seasonal cycle of hope and despair had become more pronounced in the second year. Spring brought renewed energy for searches and investigation, but also painful reminders of time passing without resolution. Alice's birthday in June became a day of vigil rather than celebration, with family members gathering to share memories and maintain their commitment to finding the truth. Detective Martinez had requested additional resources for cold case review, but budget constraints limited the department's ability to dedicate significant personnel to cases without new leads. The reality of police work meant that current crimes took priority over past mysteries, regardless of the emotional investment of the families involved. Martinez continued to follow up on tips and coordinate with other jurisdictions, but acknowledged privately that without new evidence or witnesses, the case was unlikely to progress. The psychological toll on the Harris family had become increasingly evident. Linda had developed chronic insomnia and anxiety, while Patricia's single-minded focus on the investigation had strained her marriage and relationships with her own children. Family gatherings, once joyful occasions, now centered around case discussions and theories about Alice's fate. The family's identity had become inextricably linked to the search effort, making it difficult to imagine how they might function if the case were ever resolved. As winter approached in 1984, the second anniversary of Alice's disappearance loomed as a potential milestone of acceptance or renewed determination. The family faced increasing pressure from well-meaning friends and relatives to move on and find closure, advice that felt like betrayal to people who believed that Alice might still be alive somewhere, waiting for rescue or justice. The investigation had revealed the broader systemic issues affecting missing persons cases, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. Alice's disappearance had exposed gaps in service worker screening, limitations in interjurisdictional communication, and the tendency of investigations to lose momentum when quick solutions weren't found. Patricia had begun corresponding with lawmakers about improving protocols for missing persons investigations, turning her personal tragedy into advocacy for systemic change. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. October 15, 1984, began as an ordinary Tuesday morning in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Chicago's South Side. Margaret Chen was preparing for work when she heard an unusual sound in the hallway outside her apartment, a familiar whimpering that made her heart stop. After nearly 2 years of silence, after countless false hopes and devastating disappointments, Buddy had come home. The German Shepherd stood in the hallway outside Alice Harris's apartment, his once glossy coat now matted and thin, his ribs visible through patchy fur. But it wasn't his physical condition that stopped Margaret's breath. It was what he carried in his mouth. Clenched between his teeth was a piece of dark blue fabric, stained with what appeared to be dried blood, wrapped around something small and metallic that glinted in the fluorescent hallway light. Margaret's scream brought neighbors running from 3 different apartments. Mrs. Eleanor Washington, who had become Patricia's closest ally in the search for Alice, immediately recognized Buddy despite his deteriorated condition. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, dropping to her knees as the exhausted dog collapsed at her feet. "Where have you been, baby? Where's Alice?" Buddy refused to release the object in his mouth, growling softly when anyone approached too closely. He allowed Mrs. Washington to stroke his head and offer him water, but maintained a protective grip on whatever he had carried home. His eyes, once bright and alert, now held a haunted quality that seemed to reflect trauma beyond physical neglect. The call to Patricia Harris Williams came at 9:17 a.m. She was at work at the bank where she had recently returned part-time, trying to rebuild some financial stability after 2 years of private investigation expenses. When her supervisor handed her the phone, and she heard Mrs. Washington's voice saying, "Patricia, honey, you need to come home right now. Buddy's back," Patricia felt her legs give way. The drive from the north side to Bronzeville passed in a blur of impossible hope and nauseating fear. Patricia had dreamed of this moment countless times, Buddy returning to lead them to Alice, or bringing proof of what had happened to her sister. But the reality was far more complex and terrifying than any scenario she had imagined. If Buddy had returned after 2 years, what did that mean for Alice? Detective Martinez arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of the initial call. By then, a small crowd had gathered in the hallway. Neighbors and onlookers drawn by the commotion and the impossible sight of Alice's guide dog. Martinez immediately called for backup and crime scene technicians, recognizing that Buddy's return potentially represented the first real evidence in the case. The process of coaxing the evidence from Buddy's mouth required patience and expertise. Animal control officers with specialized training in traumatized animals worked carefully to gain the dog's trust. After nearly 3 hours, Buddy finally released his grip, revealing a blood-stained piece of blue fabric wrapped around Alice's distinctive silver bracelet, a piece of jewelry she had worn every day for the past 15 years. The bracelet was immediately recognizable to family members and friends. It had been a gift from Alice's parents on her college graduation, engraved with her initials and a small musical note. The fabric appeared to be from a woman's blouse or dress, though the exact garment would require forensic analysis to determine. Most significantly, both the fabric and bracelet showed signs of having been buried or hidden in earth for an extended period. Buddy's physical examination revealed the toll of his nearly 2-year absence. Veterinarian Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had provided Buddy's original training certification, estimated that the dog had lost approximately 30 pounds and showed signs of having lived wild for extended periods. His paws were scarred and hardened from rough terrain, and his behavior suggested psychological trauma consistent with witnessing or experiencing violence. More intriguingly, Dr. Mitchell's examination revealed that Buddy had been cared for by humans during at least part of his absence. His teeth showed evidence of having been fed processed dog food rather than scavenged meals, and he had received some veterinary care, including treatment for what appeared to be a leg injury that had healed improperly. Someone had kept Alice's guide dog for months or possibly years before he had either escaped or been released. The implications of Buddy's condition created a new and disturbing dimension to the investigation. If Buddy had been held by whoever was responsible for Alice's disappearance, his return might represent a deliberate message rather than an accident. The timing of his reappearance, carrying evidence that could potentially break the case open, seemed too coincidental to be random. Patricia's reunion with Buddy was heartbreaking and hopeful simultaneously. The dog recognized her immediately, responding to her voice and accepting her touch in ways that suggested he remembered their relationship. But his behavior also indicated that he was searching for Alice, periodically returning to her apartment door and whimpering softly as if expecting her to appear. The crime scene analysis of Alice's apartment, sealed since her disappearance, took on new urgency with Buddy's return. Investigators searched for any signs that someone might have entered the apartment recently, or that Buddy might have left additional evidence. While no obvious signs of intrusion were found, the fact that Buddy had returned specifically to Alice's building suggested that location held significance for understanding his captivity and release. Detective Martinez coordinated with FBI behavioral analysts to develop theories about why Buddy might have been returned at this specific time. The 2-year gap suggested that whoever had held him wanted the case to remain cold long enough for any immediate investigation to lose momentum. The fact that Buddy carried evidence, rather than simply being released, implied that someone wanted Alice's disappearance to be solved, but only after sufficient time had passed. The blood-stained fabric and Alice's bracelet were rushed to the Illinois State Police Forensics Laboratory for DNA analysis, fingerprint examination, and material comparison. The blood, if it belonged to Alice, could provide crucial evidence about what had happened to her. If it belonged to someone else, it might identify her attacker or provide leads about other victims. Frank Kowalski, the private investigator, theorized that Buddy's return represented either a guilty conscience or a calculated risk by someone who believed they could no longer be connected to Alice's disappearance. The missing service worker Thomas Brennan remained the primary suspect, but his continued absence made it impossible to determine whether he was responsible for Buddy's captivity and release. The neighborhood responded to Buddy's return with a mixture of celebration and renewed anxiety. Children who had grown up hearing stories about the missing teacher and her faithful dog now saw concrete evidence that something terrible had happened. Parents faced difficult questions about justice, safety, and whether the person responsible for Alice's disappearance might still be living among them. As news of Buddy's return spread through local media, tips and potential sightings flooded the police department. Several people reported seeing a German Shepherd matching Buddy's description in various Chicago neighborhoods over the past 2 years, though most of these reports proved to be other dogs. More significantly, 3 separate witnesses came forward, claiming to have seen a man matching Thomas Brennan's description in the company of a German Shepherd in different locations around the city. The Harris family found themselves caught between hope and despair as Buddy's return brought Alice's case back into public focus. While they celebrated having Alice's beloved companion back safely, the evidence he carried suggested that their worst fears about Alice's fate might be true. The blood-stained bracelet represented both the possibility of answers and the probability of devastating news. The Illinois State Police Forensics Laboratory in Springfield became the focal point of renewed hope as technicians began their analysis of the evidence Buddy had carried home. The blood-stained fabric and Alice's bracelet represented the first physical evidence in a case that had been built entirely on theories and speculation for nearly 2 years. DNA analysis in 1984 was limited compared to modern capabilities, but the technology existed to determine blood type and basic genetic markers. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the laboratory's chief forensic analyst, began the painstaking process of extracting testable samples from fabric that had been exposed to earth and weather for an unknown period. The condition of the evidence suggested it had been buried or hidden outdoors, then recently retrieved by someone who knew its location. The first breakthrough came within 48 hours. The blood on the fabric was type O negative, matching Alice's medical records from her doctor visits related to diabetes management. More significantly, the blood showed signs of having coagulated rapidly, suggesting that Alice had suffered a significant injury that caused immediate, heavy bleeding. The pattern of bloodstains indicated that the fabric had been pressed directly against a wound rather than being splattered from a distance. The fabric itself provided additional clues. Analysis revealed it to be a cotton-polyester blend, consistent with women's clothing manufactured in the early 1980s. The blue dye matched samples from a blouse found in Alice's closet, suggesting that the evidence came from clothing she had been wearing at the time of her disappearance. Microscopic examination revealed soil particles embedded in the fibers, soil that contained traces of limestone and clay consistent with areas south of Chicago. Alice's bracelet told its own story through forensic examination. The silver showed tarnishing patterns consistent with underground burial, and microscopic analysis revealed the same soil composition found on the fabric. More significantly, the bracelet's clasp had been cut rather than broken, suggesting deliberate removal rather than accidental loss during a struggle. Detective Martinez coordinated with geological experts to narrow down potential burial sites based on the soil analysis. The limestone and clay composition pointed to specific areas in Cook County and neighboring counties where similar soil could be found. Armed with this information, search teams began focusing on abandoned properties, construction sites, and rural areas within a 50-mile radius of Chicago. The forensic analysis also revealed disturbing evidence about Buddy's captivity. Examination of his collar showed wear patterns, suggesting he had been chained or tethered for extended periods. More troubling, veterinary analysis found traces of sedatives in his system, indicating that he had been drugged recently, possibly to facilitate his transport and release at Alice's apartment building. Private investigator Frank Kowalski developed a theory that whoever had held Buddy wanted the dog to lead investigators to additional evidence. The fact that Buddy had been released carrying Alice's bracelet seemed designed to focus attention on a specific location or individual. Kowalski suspected that the perpetrator either felt safe enough to allow the investigation to proceed or was attempting to frame someone else for Alice's disappearance. The search for Thomas Brennan intensified as forensic evidence suggested Alice's disappearance involved premeditation and specific knowledge of her routines. FBI behavioral analysts theorized that Brennan had planned Alice's abduction carefully, possibly watching her for weeks before acting. The fact that Buddy had been kept alive suggested either genuine affection for the dog or recognition that Buddy might serve as evidence at a later time. Renewed media attention brought forward several new witnesses who had previously been reluctant to speak with police. Mary Rodriguez, who lived 3 blocks from Alice's apartment, reported seeing a man loading a large dog into a dark sedan on the night of Alice's disappearance. Her description of the man matched Thomas Brennan's physical characteristics, though she couldn't positively identify him from photographs. More significantly, James Patterson, a construction worker, came forward with information about suspicious activity at an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's west side. Patterson reported seeing someone burying objects behind the building in late 1982, shortly after Alice's disappearance. He hadn't reported it at the time because he assumed it was related to illegal dumping, but Buddy's return made him reconsider the significance of what he had witnessed. The warehouse Patterson described was located in an area with soil composition matching the forensic analysis. Detective Martinez obtained a search warrant and organized an excavation of the property. The search required careful coordination with the fire department and structural engineers due to the building's deteriorated condition and potential safety hazards. On November 3, 1984, exactly 3 weeks after Buddy's return, the excavation team made a discovery that confirmed the Harris family's worst fears while providing the evidence needed to pursue justice. Buried 3 feet beneath the warehouse's concrete floor, investigators found Alice Harris's remains, along with her clothing, purse, and other personal effects. The discovery brought devastating closure to nearly 2 years of uncertainty, while raising new questions about the circumstances of Alice's death and the delayed revelation of her fate. Medical examiner Dr. William Foster determined that Alice had died from blunt force trauma to the head, suggesting that her death had been relatively quick rather than the prolonged captivity that some theories had proposed. Evidence found with Alice's body included additional items that hadn't been present when Buddy returned to her apartment. A partially burned notebook contained handwritten notes that appeared to be surveillance records of Alice's daily routines, including detailed timings of her walks and observations about her apartment's security. The handwriting analysis would require comparison with samples from Thomas Brennan and other potential suspects. The location of Alice's burial site provided investigators with new leads about her killer's knowledge of Chicago's industrial areas. The abandoned warehouse had been vacant for several years, but records showed that Thomas Brennan had worked construction jobs in the vicinity during 1981 and early 1982. His familiarity with the location would explain why he had chosen it as a burial site and why he felt confident that Alice's body would remain undiscovered. Patricia Harris Williams received the news of Alice's discovery with a mixture of grief and relief that defied easy description. After 2 years of hoping that Alice might still be alive somewhere, the confirmation of her death brought an end to the torturous uncertainty that had defined the family's existence. Yet the evidence also provided hope that Alice's killer might finally face justice. The Harris family's long ordeal was far from over, but Buddy's return had provided the breakthrough that transformed Alice's disappearance from an unsolved mystery into a homicide investigation with physical evidence and clear leads. The faithful guide dog had somehow found a way to bring his beloved companion home and set in motion the events that would ultimately reveal the truth about her fate. If this case has already caught your attention, leave a like. It helps Alice Harris's story reach more people. The discovery of Alice Harris's remains transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into an active homicide investigation with physical evidence, credible leads, and renewed resources from the Chicago Police Department. Detective Martinez found himself leading a task force that included FBI behavioral analysts, forensic specialists, and investigators from multiple jurisdictions where similar disappearances had occurred. The handwritten surveillance notes found with Alice's body provided a chilling glimpse into her killer's methodical preparation. The notebook contained detailed observations spanning several weeks before her disappearance, including precise timings of her daily walks, notes about her apartment's security features, and observations about her interactions with neighbors and service providers. The level of detail suggested someone who had invested significant time in planning Alice's abduction and murder. Handwriting analysis conducted by FBI specialists confirmed that the surveillance notes matched samples obtained from Thomas Brennan's employment records and apartment lease applications. The discovery provided the first direct evidence linking Brennan to Alice's disappearance and murder, transforming him from a person of interest into the primary suspect in a capital murder case. The nationwide manhunt for Thomas Brennan intensified as investigators coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the United States. The FBI issued federal warrants for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, allowing them to pursue leads in multiple states and access resources not available to local police departments. Brennan's photograph was distributed to police departments, social services agencies, and homeless shelters throughout the Midwest and beyond. Behavioral analysts developed a profile suggesting that Brennan would likely seek employment in positions that provided access to vulnerable individuals, particularly elderly or disabled women living independently. This profile led to reviews of employment records at grocery delivery services, home healthcare agencies, and maintenance companies in cities where potential sightings had been reported. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that predated Alice's murder. Employment records showed that Brennan had been fired from 3 different jobs between 1979 and 1982 due to complaints from female clients about inappropriate behavior, theft of personal items, and violations of privacy. In each case, employers had terminated Brennan quietly rather than pursuing criminal charges, allowing him to move to new positions without his misconduct being documented in official records. Margaret Torres's disappearance in Indianapolis in 1981 took on new significance as investigators found evidence that Brennan had been living in the city at the time. Employment records showed he had worked for a home maintenance service that provided regular services to Torres's apartment building. While her body had never been recovered, Indianapolis police reopened her case as potentially connected to Brennan and Alice's murder. The financial investigation into Brennan's activities provided additional leads about his possible current location. Bank records showed that he had withdrawn his savings in cash in March 1983, as previously discovered, but new analysis revealed that he had been making regular cash deposits into different accounts for several months before Alice's disappearance. The source of these deposits remained unclear, but the amounts were consistent with income from illegal activities or stolen property. Frank Kowalski's private investigation had uncovered evidence that Brennan had been selling stolen items from his victims' homes through pawn shops and informal networks. Alice's missing diabetes testing kit, blood glucose meter, and several pieces of jewelry had never been recovered from her apartment, suggesting they had been taken as trophies or sold for money. Pawnshop records from 1982 and 1983 showed transactions involving medical equipment and jewelry matching descriptions of Alice's missing property. The search for Buddy's holding location became a priority, as investigators recognized that finding where the dog had been kept might lead to Brennan's current whereabouts or provide evidence about accomplices. Veterinary analysis suggested that Buddy had been kept in a rural or suburban environment with access to outdoor space, based on the condition of his paws and the types of plant material found in his fur. Animal behavior specialists theorized that Buddy's return to Alice's apartment represented either an escape from captivity or a deliberate release designed to provide evidence at a specific time. The fact that he had been drugged before his release suggested human involvement rather than natural escape behavior. Someone had wanted Buddy to return carrying evidence, but the motivation remained unclear. The psychological impact on the Harris family of transitioning from hope to grief to anticipation of justice created new challenges for their emotional well-being. Patricia Harris Williams found herself struggling with anger and desire for revenge that conflicted with her religious beliefs and commitment to legal justice. The knowledge that Alice's killer had been planning her murder for weeks made the crime feel even more personal and horrific. Community response to the murder investigation reflected the complex emotions surrounding Alice's case. Relief that answers had finally been found mixed with anger that the investigation had taken so long and fear that the killer remained at large. Neighborhood watch groups formed spontaneously as residents realized that Alice's murderer might have been targeting other vulnerable women in their community. The media attention surrounding the case brought forward additional witnesses and potential victims who had previously been reluctant to speak with authorities. Several women reported suspicious encounters with men matching Brennan's description in various Chicago neighborhoods during 1982 and 1983. While most of these encounters had seemed relatively harmless at the time, they now appeared to be part of a pattern of predatory behavior. Detective Martinez coordinated with cold case units in multiple states to review unsolved disappearances and murders involving vulnerable women who had contact with service workers. The investigation expanded to include cases in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, where similar patterns had been noted but never connected to a single perpetrator. The forensic analysis of evidence from Alice's burial site continued to provide new information about the circumstances of her death and the killer's behavior afterward. Soil analysis suggested that her body had been moved at least once before being buried in its final location, indicating that Brennan had initially hidden her remains elsewhere before deciding on the warehouse location. Evidence of accelerant found on Alice's clothing suggested that Brennan had attempted to destroy physical evidence by burning some of her belongings, but had been interrupted or changed his mind before completing the destruction. The partial burning had actually preserved some evidence that might otherwise have been lost, including fibers that matched clothing found in Brennan's abandoned apartment. The investigation team developed a timeline suggesting that Alice had been killed shortly after her disappearance, contrary to earlier theories that she might have been held captive for days or weeks. The rapid coagulation of blood on the fabric Buddy had carried home indicated that Alice had died from her injuries within hours of being attacked. As winter approached in 1984, the investigation had developed multiple leads and substantial evidence, but Thomas Brennan remained at large. The task force continued to pursue tips and coordinate with law enforcement agencies nationwide, while the Harris family prepared for the possibility that bringing Alice's killer to justice might take months or years of additional investigation. The case had revealed systemic issues in employment screening, interjurisdictional communication, and support for vulnerable populations that extended far beyond Alice's individual tragedy. Patricia Harris Williams had begun working with lawmakers and advocacy groups to improve background check requirements for service workers and enhance coordination between police departments investigating similar crimes. If this case has already caught your attention, leave a like. It helps Alice Harris's story reach more people. December 1984 brought the first significant breakthrough in locating Thomas Brennan since the discovery of Alice Harris's remains. Our tip from an unexpected source would finally provide investigators with the lead they needed to bring Alice's killer to justice. But the revelation would also expose the extent of Brennan's crimes and the number of victims whose fates had remained unknown. The breakthrough came from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the veterinarian who had examined Buddy upon his return. While reviewing her notes about the dog's condition, Dr. Mitchell realized that she had seen another German Shepherd with similar injuries and behavioral patterns 3 months earlier. The dog had been brought to her clinic by a man who claimed to be its owner, but had seemed unfamiliar with the animal's basic needs and temperament. Dr. Mitchell's records showed that the man had paid for the dog's treatment in cash and had provided a false name and address. However, he had driven a distinctive blue pickup truck with temporary license plates that Dr. Mitchell had noted because he had parked illegally in a space reserved for emergency cases. Her detailed notes provided investigators with the first solid lead about Brennan's possible current location and vehicle. The temporary license plates were traced to a dealership in Gary, Indiana, where records showed that a man matching Brennan's description had purchased the truck using false identification in September 1984. The dealership owner remembered the transaction because the buyer had seemed nervous and had insisted on paying the full amount in cash, which was unusual for such a significant purchase. Detective Martinez coordinated with Gary Police Department to canvass the area around the dealership, focusing on hotels, boarding houses, and temporary housing where someone using false identification might have stayed. The search expanded to include employment agencies and job sites where Brennan might have found work in the construction or service industries. The investigation received additional resources when the FBI officially classified the case as part of a potential serial murder investigation. Analysis of similar disappearances in multiple states had identified at least 6 cases where women matching Alice's profile had disappeared under circumstances suggesting the involvement of service workers or delivery personnel. While physical evidence was limited in most of these cases, the behavioral patterns and victimology suggested a single perpetrator. Frank Kowalski's private investigation had identified a pattern in Brennan's employment history that provided insight into his selection of victims and hunting grounds. Brennan consistently sought positions that provided legitimate access to women's homes, particularly jobs that involved regular contact with the same clients over extended periods. This pattern allowed him to observe potential victims, assess their vulnerability, and plan attacks with minimal risk of detection. The breakthrough in the case came on December 18, 1984, when Chicago police received a call from the Cook County Sheriff's Department about a suspicious death in an unincorporated area southwest of the city. A woman identified as Dorothy Chen, 58, had been found dead in her home by neighbors who had become concerned when she failed to appear for a scheduled appointment. Initial investigation of Dorothy Chen's death revealed circumstances eerily similar to Alice Harris's disappearance. Chen lived alone, was partially disabled due to vision problems, and had been receiving regular grocery deliveries from a service that employed temporary workers. Her death had initially been attributed to natural causes, but the discovery of her missing purse and jewelry, along with signs of forced entry, suggested foul play. More significantly, neighbors reported seeing a blue pickup truck parked near Chen's home on multiple occasions during the weeks before her death. The truck's driver had been observed apparently conducting surveillance of the neighborhood and taking notes about residents' routines. The description of both the vehicle and the driver matched the information Dr. Mitchell had provided about the man who had brought the injured German Shepherd to her clinic. The connection between Dorothy Chen's death and the search for Thomas Brennan prompted immediate action from the task force. Crime scene investigators found evidence that Chen's home had been searched systematically, with particular attention paid to items that might have value for resale. The pattern matched evidence found at crime scenes connected to other suspected victims in the multi-state investigation. Forensic analysis of the Chen crime scene revealed fingerprints that matched samples obtained from Thomas Brennan's previous employment records and apartment lease applications. For the first time since Alice's disappearance, investigators had direct physical evidence placing Brennan at a crime scene. The discovery provided grounds for federal murder charges and intensified the nationwide manhunt. The investigation team developed a theory that Brennan had been active in the Chicago area much longer than previously suspected, possibly returning periodically to commit crimes before retreating to safer locations. This pattern would explain the gaps in his employment history and the difficulty investigators had experienced in tracking his movements over the previous 2 years. Patricia Harris Williams learned about Dorothy Chen's death and its connection to Alice's case through Detective Martinez, who had called to inform the family about the developments in the investigation. The news brought mixed emotions: relief that progress was being made in identifying Alice's killer, but horror at the realization that other women had died while Brennan remained free. The Chen family's grief mirrored the Harris family's experience from 2 years earlier, but with the additional trauma of learning that their loss was connected to a series of murders that might have been prevented. Dorothy Chen's daughter, Susan Chen Williams, contacted Patricia to share their family's parallel experiences and coordinate their efforts to support the investigation. Community response to Dorothy Chen's murder and its connection to Alice's case created new urgency around safety measures for vulnerable residents. Social service agencies implemented additional screening requirements for workers, while neighborhood watch programs expanded to include regular check-ins with elderly and disabled residents who lived alone. The media attention surrounding the connected murders brought forward additional witnesses and potential victims who had survived encounters with someone matching Brennan's description. These accounts provided investigators with a more complete picture of Brennan's methods and helped identify additional locations where he might have committed crimes. As 1984 drew to a close, the investigation had developed substantial evidence against Thomas Brennan and identified multiple victims of what appeared to be a systematic campaign of murder targeting vulnerable women. The challenge now was locating Brennan before he could claim additional victims or disappear permanently into the underground networks that had sheltered him for the previous 2 years. The task force prepared for what they anticipated would be the final phase of the investigation, tracking Brennan to his current location and bringing him into custody. The evidence was overwhelming, the resources were substantial, and the motivation was personal for investigators who had seen the devastation Brennan's crimes had caused to multiple families and communities. Detective Martinez, now months away from retirement, was determined that the Alice Harris case would not join the ranks of unsolved murders that haunted police departments across the country. The investigation had become more than a professional obligation. It represented a chance to provide justice for victims whose voices had been silenced and families whose lives had been shattered by one man's predatory violence. The new year of 1985 began with the most intensive manhunt in Chicago Police Department's recent history as investigators closed in on Thomas Brennan's location. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis had created a comprehensive profile of Brennan's activities and probable whereabouts, but capturing a suspect who had successfully evaded law enforcement for over 2 years required careful planning and coordination. The break came from an unexpected source on January 15, 1985. A parole officer in Milwaukee contacted the FBI after recognizing Brennan's photograph in a nationwide bulletin. Officer Robert Hayes reported that a man matching Brennan's description had been living in a halfway house under the assumed name Thomas Bradford since November 1984. The false identity had been sophisticated enough to pass routine background checks, but Hayes's attention to detail had noticed inconsistencies in Bradford's employment history and references. FBI agents coordinated with Milwaukee police to establish surveillance of the halfway house without alerting Brennan to their presence. The surveillance revealed that Brennan had been working part-time at a medical supply company that served nursing homes and assisted living facilities throughout southeastern Wisconsin. His position provided access to information about vulnerable residents and their daily routines, suggesting that he might have been planning additional crimes. The decision to arrest Brennan required careful timing to ensure that evidence wasn't destroyed and that additional victims could be identified and protected. The task force developed a plan to take Brennan into custody during his work shift, when he would be separated from any weapons or escape routes he might have prepared at his residence. On January 22, 1985, Thomas Brennan was arrested without incident as he arrived for work at Medical Supply Solutions in Milwaukee. The arrest team included FBI agents, Milwaukee police detectives, and Detective Martinez, who had traveled from Chicago to witness the culmination of the investigation he had led for over 2 years. Brennan offered no resistance, but also provided no immediate confession or cooperation with investigators. The search of Brennan's room at the halfway house revealed evidence that confirmed investigators' worst fears about the scope of his crimes. Hidden beneath his mattress, authorities found detailed surveillance notes about at least 12 different women in the Milwaukee area, including photographs, daily routine observations, and assessments of their vulnerability and potential value as victims. More disturbing was the discovery of a collection of personal items that appeared to be trophies from previous victims. The collection included jewelry, medical devices, and personal photographs that matched descriptions of missing property from unsolved cases in multiple states. Among these items were Alice Harris's diabetes testing kit and a small music box that her family immediately recognized as a treasured possession from her childhood. The evidence found in Brennan's possession provided investigators with leads to reopen cold cases spanning 5 states and 7 years of criminal activity. The scope of Brennan's crimes was far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected, with potential victims, including at least 15 women who had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances between 1978 and 1984. Brennan's interrogation revealed a calculating and methodical killer who had refined his techniques over years of practice. He initially denied involvement in any crimes, but gradually began providing information about his activities when confronted with overwhelming physical evidence. His cooperation appeared motivated more by a desire to control the narrative than by genuine remorse for his actions. The confession process took several days as investigators worked through evidence from multiple jurisdictions and crime scenes. Brennan described his method of selecting victims through his various employment positions, conducting surveillance to identify vulnerable women with predictable routines, and planning attacks that minimized his risk of detection or apprehension. Alice Harris's murder emerged as one of Brennan's most carefully planned crimes. He had been observing her for nearly 6 weeks before acting, using his position as a grocery delivery driver to gain detailed knowledge of her apartment, her schedule, and her relationship with Buddy. The attack had been planned for the evening when Alice was most predictable in her routine and when neighbors were least likely to be observing the street. Brennan's account of Alice's final moments was devastating for her family to hear, but provided the closure they had been seeking for over 2 years. Alice had been attacked while returning from her evening walk, struck from behind as she approached her apartment building. She had died quickly from her injuries, according to Brennan, without suffering prolonged pain or terror. The revelation about Buddy's captivity provided insight into Brennan's psychological state and his relationship with his crimes. Brennan had kept the guide dog as a trophy and reminder of his power over Alice, but had also developed an attachment to the animal that had complicated his plans to dispose of evidence. Buddy's return had been orchestrated by Brennan as a way to reveal Alice's fate while maintaining some control over the investigation's timeline. Patricia Harris Williams was present for portions of Brennan's confession, a difficult but necessary experience that provided her with direct answers to questions that had haunted her family for years. Learning the details of Alice's final hours was traumatic, but it also validated the family's belief that Alice had been the victim of a predatory criminal rather than a random accident or misunderstanding. The legal process began immediately as prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions coordinated charges against Brennan for crimes committed across state lines over several years. The Alice Harris murder case would serve as the primary prosecution vehicle, with additional charges filed as evidence was processed and additional victims were identified. Brennan's defense team attempted to negotiate a plea agreement, that would avoid the death penalty in exchange for cooperation in identifying additional victims and providing information about unsolved cases. However, the overwhelming evidence against him and the heinous nature of his crimes made prosecutors reluctant to offer significant concessions in exchange for his cooperation. The Harris family faced the difficult decision of whether to support a plea agreement that might provide more information about Alice's final days in exchange for allowing her killer to avoid the ultimate punishment. Patricia struggled with the ethical implications of these choices, while also recognizing that a lengthy trial would extend the family's ordeal and potentially provide Brennan with additional opportunities to manipulate the legal process. Community response to Brennan's arrest provided some measure of closure for neighborhoods that had lived with uncertainty and fear since Alice's disappearance. The knowledge that her killer had been captured and would face justice helped heal some of the trauma that had affected the broader community, though the revelation of additional victims created new grief for families who had never known the fate of their missing loved ones. As winter turned to spring in 1985, the investigation team began the complex process of building prosecution cases that would ensure Thomas Brennan faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. The evidence was substantial, the confession was detailed, and the legal framework existed to pursue justice for Alice Harris and the other women whose lives had been stolen by a predator who had hidden among the very people trusted to help them maintain their independence. The trial of Thomas Brennan began on September 16, 1985, in the criminal court of Cook County, Illinois. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Margaret Sullivan, faced the complex challenge of presenting evidence spanning multiple years and jurisdictions while maintaining focus on the specific murder of Alice Harris. The case had drawn national attention as one of the most comprehensive serial murder prosecutions of the decade. The courtroom was filled with family members of Brennan's victims, law enforcement officers who had worked the various investigations, and community members who had been affected by the crimes. Patricia Harris Williams sat in the front row with her sister Linda and other family members, prepared to endure the difficult process of hearing evidence about Alice's final hours while seeking the justice they had pursued for nearly 3 years. Detective Martinez, now retired but serving as a key witness, testified about the initial investigation and the challenges of tracking a suspect who had systematically covered his tracks while moving between jurisdictions. His testimony highlighted the systemic issues that had allowed Brennan to continue killing for years, despite multiple contacts with law enforcement and employment agencies. The prosecution's case was built around physical evidence, witness testimony, and Brennan's own confessions. The blood-stained fabric and Alice's bracelet that Buddy had carried home served as powerful symbols of the connection between victim and killer. Forensic experts testified about DNA analysis, soil composition, and the methodical nature of the surveillance notes found in Brennan's possession. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the forensic analyst who had processed the evidence from Alice's burial site, provided detailed testimony about the timeline of Alice's death and the circumstances surrounding her murder. Her scientific analysis contradicted defense arguments that Alice's death had been accidental or unpremeditated, establishing that Brennan had planned and executed the attack with deliberate intent to kill. The defense strategy attempted to portray Brennan as mentally ill and unable to control his impulses, arguing for reduced charges based on diminished capacity. Defense attorney Robert Chen presented psychiatric testimony suggesting that Brennan suffered from personality disorders that impaired his judgment and moral reasoning. However, the systematic nature of his crimes and his ability to maintain false identities and employment undermined arguments about his mental competency. Victim impact statements provided some of the most powerful testimony in the trial. Patricia Harris Williams spoke about Alice's life, her contributions to the community, and the devastating impact her loss had on family and friends. The testimony of other family members whose loved ones had been killed by Brennan created a comprehensive picture of the human cost of his crimes. Susan Chen Williams, daughter of Dorothy Chen, testified about the parallel trauma experienced by families of Brennan's victims. Her alliance with the Harris family had grown into advocacy for improved safety measures and support services for vulnerable adults living independently. Their joint testimony highlighted the broader social implications of predatory crimes targeting disabled and elderly community members. The jury deliberation lasted 3 days, during which they reviewed extensive physical evidence and considered testimony from over 40 witnesses. The complexity of the case required careful examination of forensic evidence, timeline analysis, and evaluation of Brennan's mental state at the time of the murders. On October 7, 1985, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges, including first-degree murder in Alice Harris's death, first-degree murder in Dorothy Chen's death, and multiple counts of burglary, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. The unanimous verdicts reflected the jury's conclusion that Brennan had acted with premeditation and full awareness of his actions. The sentencing phase began immediately, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty based on the heinous nature of the crimes and the multiple victims. The defense presented mitigation evidence about Brennan's childhood trauma and mental health issues, arguing for life imprisonment without possibility of parole rather than execution. Patricia Harris Williams testified during the sentencing phase about her family's position on the death penalty. After months of internal struggle, she had decided to support life imprisonment rather than execution, explaining that her Christian faith and Alice's own values led her to reject revenge in favor of justice that protected society without taking another life. Judge William Morrison sentenced Thomas Brennan to life imprisonment without possibility of parole on multiple counts, to be served consecutively rather than concurrently. The sentence effectively guaranteed that Brennan would never be released from prison, providing protection for potential future victims while avoiding the lengthy appeals process associated with death penalty cases. The conclusion of Brennan's trial marked the end of a 3-year ordeal for the Harris family, but also the beginning of their efforts to ensure that Alice's legacy would contribute to positive change. Patricia Harris Williams used the media attention surrounding the case to advocate for improved background check requirements for service workers and enhanced coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating similar crimes. The Alice Harris Foundation, established by the family in 1986, provided support services for families of missing persons and advocated for legislative changes to improve safety for vulnerable adults. The Foundation's work contributed to the passage of enhanced background check requirements for workers providing services to elderly and disabled clients, helping prevent future tragedies similar to Alice's murder. Buddy, Alice's faithful guide dog, lived with Patricia's family for the remainder of his life, becoming a symbol of loyalty and the unbreakable bond between Alice and those who loved her. His role in solving Alice's murder was commemorated in a small memorial garden at St. Mark's Baptist Church, where Alice had served as pianist for many years. Detective Martinez, despite his retirement, continued to work on cold cases potentially connected to Brennan's activities. His investigation had identified at least 8 additional victims across multiple states, leading to prosecutions that provided closure for families who had waited years for answers about their missing loved ones. The case had far-reaching impacts on law enforcement practices, particularly in the area of interjurisdictional cooperation and information sharing. The difficulties experienced in tracking Brennan across state lines led to improved communication protocols and database systems that would later evolve into modern missing persons and criminal tracking networks. Thomas Brennan remained in prison for the rest of his life, never expressing genuine remorse for his crimes or providing complete information about all of his victims. He died in Illinois State Penitentiary in 2003, taking with him secrets about additional crimes that would never be fully resolved. Alice Harris's story became part of the broader narrative about violence against vulnerable populations and the importance of community vigilance in protecting those who cannot fully protect themselves. Her memory lived on through the foundation bearing her name, the legislative changes her case inspired, and the countless individuals whose lives were made safer by the lessons learned from her tragedy. The neighborhood where Alice had lived slowly healed from the trauma of her disappearance and murder, but her memory remained strong in the community she had served. The small park where she and Buddy had walked every evening was renamed Alice Harris Memorial Park, featuring a bench where visitors could sit and remember a woman whose life had been cut short, but whose impact continued to resonate decades later. Patricia Harris Williams continued her advocacy work into her 80s, speaking at conferences, supporting legislation, and providing comfort to families facing similar losses. Her transformation from grieving sister to national advocate demonstrated the potential for personal tragedy to inspire positive change and prevent future suffering. The case of Alice Harris and the investigation that brought her killer to justice represented both the best and worst of human nature, the evil of predatory violence and the good of persistent love, community support, and the pursuit of justice. Alice's legacy lived on not in the manner of her death, but in the lives saved and families protected by the changes her case had inspired. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Alice Harris's story. We'll see you in the next video. Final reflection. In the darkness of disappearance, sometimes the most faithful hearts find a way to bring light home. Alice Harris's story reminds us that justice may be delayed, but love and truth have a way of surviving even the deepest burial.